Hello, my name is Jessica Flutie, and I am privileged to have the role of Director and Curator of this Skoll World Forum and other Skoll convenings. And I'm here to welcome you to this very important session focusing on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. I am looking forward to hearing from several women with great insights into the conflict, to the evolving situation on the ground, even just this week, and the steps that each of us might take to help the Ukrainian people from wherever we sit in the social impact space. Before we get started, just a few items. This session is being recorded and will be released publicly after the event. Please feel free to use the chat box to engage with the speakers and ask any questions, and we will turn to those toward the end of the session. On social media, we are using hashtag SkollWF and would appreciate it if you would do the same to follow along with the conversation. And finally, I now have the privilege of turning it over to my very impressive new colleague, Rhee, who is Chief Communications and Partnerships Officer at the Skoll Foundation. Alice, over to you.
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks to all of you for joining. It is just hard to comprehend the images out of Ukraine each day, particularly the horrific images from Bucha. The UN says that more than 4 million people have fled Ukraine. An estimated 6.5 million have been displaced. That human toll is staggering. That's the topic of our panel today. But before we start, we want to acknowledge the legacy of former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Here's Skoll CEO Don Gibbs.
I wanted to take a moment and stop and recognize my colleague and friend, the late Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright came to visit us at the Skoll Foundation 2 years ago, and her remarks reminded us of the importance of fighting for democracy and freedom around the world. She's inspired all of us to carry her torch forward.
The first signs, I think, that one has to worry about is if there is a leader who actually exacerbates differences and makes people feel that they do not have something in common with a different group of people. So kind of a leader who identifies a tribal group and divides them from the other people, where then the outside group is viewed as being at fault, the scapegoat. And so there is developed real hatred between groups within a society. We've gone through previous periods of change, but I do think that this is one that is particularly moving in a direction where we don't quite know where it's going. To some extent, the technology has become part of the arsenal of that leader who wants to divide us. And so rather than looking for ways to work together, the kinds of things that are happening now are dividing us even more, and that's what gives me a lot of pause. We look like we're victims of change when we, as Americans, should be especially riding the change for the good of our people and those in other parts of the world. We are better off when governments are reflective of the will of the people, and people are able to live in freedom and have the kinds of lives where they can support their families and speak the language they want to and be the religion they want to, and that we respect each other and recognize our common humanity.
That again, the late U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and her aspirations and dreams really for a world of peace. And it's one that we're not seeing today with the crisis in Ukraine. Let's turn to our panelists. Let me introduce Alex Toma, the Executive Director of the Peace and Security Funders Group, Jocelyn Wyatt, the CEO of Alight, and Nicola Reindorp, CEO of Crisis Action, a past Skoll awardee. Thank you all for being here.
Great to be here.
Nicola, let's begin with you. Your organization, Crisis Action, works to protect civilians from armed conflict. It's actually even sad to admit that this kind of organization has to exist. So with all of your experience, what to you is distinct about the crisis in Ukraine, and how is your organization responding?
Thanks so much, Alice. And just before I go, just before I go on, just a moment of tribute to the late, great Madeleine Albright that I and we at Crisis Action have had the privilege to collaborate with, because Secretary Albright understood the power of coalitions, and that's what Crisis Action does. So we build coalitions to protect people from war. And concretely, what we do at moments of crisis is we rapidly mobilize and scale up our global network of partners. That's human rights organizations, humanitarian organizations, peace-building organizations across the world, Middle East, Africa, globally, including allies in business, politicians like Madeleine Albright, lawyers, faith leaders, who otherwise wouldn't work together to help them collaborate and influence those with power to protect civilians caught up in war, whether that's in Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, or agonizingly in these days in Ukraine. And core to our model and our way of operating is that belief that different groups are more influential, speaking truth to power or proposing smart policy options if they speak with one voice, if they share a common message, or when they've got powerful allies to convince those who currently have the power to protect, to make people safer from war. So it's this model that helps groups collaborate so they can have more impact together. The idea is it has to be somebody's full-time job. So that's what our team do, working behind the scenes. We listen to different perspectives about why people are at risk of conflict and what's most urgent to protect them, and then propose a way to work together to change issues that are too complex for any one organization to do alone. And a situation like Ukraine, as you've said, of a scale and an enormity that's huge. Core to how we work is putting the voices and views of those affected by a conflict at the heart of what we do. And so that's why in Ukraine, on that weekend where we could hardly believe that President Putin had taken the decision to invade, we supported a network of Ukrainian organizations coming together to express their views to the world, to get their voice out to the media, and to mobilize other influential individuals, former presidents, prime ministers, to back what was called the Kyiv Declaration of demands to the world of what the people of Ukraine, of these incredible civil society brave leaders wanted. We also then convened our network of partners from around the world, the eyes and ears, to ask how we could help them work together. So that was 80 organizations in a matter of hours. As I say, human rights organizations, human rights peace building. We also brought Ukrainian and Russian civil society to that call, and the former Prime Minister of Finland, Alex Stubbs, somebody who personally has met with and knows Putin. What came out of that was, I think, 5 key areas where we have been working to support partners. So first, the idea of what is going to stop this horror for President Putin to be deterred and contained from being able to sustain this assault. That's both in support to the Ukrainian people that demand from Ukrainians was a no-fly zone, was sanctions and a rising economic cost, including on the elite, as we've heard on an earlier panel, on Russia, on Putin's high-profile friends, and rising domestic opposition. So how to contain and deter him. Secondly, for Putin to be convinced that he needs to stop, it's in his interest to halt and pursue a political route via intermediaries. We've seen the Turks and the Israelis trying this. Thirdly, to meet the immediate humanitarian needs of Ukraine that have been escalating, Ukrainians that have been escalating in an appalling way, including halting attacks, getting assistance to people, and honouring the right to asylum when people have to make this horrific decision to flee their homes. Fourth, to ensure there will be accountability for crimes that have been committed. And finally, the need to spur an attention on the conflicts that actually where the conflict of Putin's decisions will be lethal, not just for the people of Ukraine, but are and will prove lethal for those in the conflicts beyond the headlines that are exacerbated, whether by weak prices or distracted political attention. So in Yemen, in the Sahel, in Ethiopia. So that framework we felt was the areas where we needed to try and support our partners. And immediately, to make a reality of that, we prioritized taking a delegation of Ukrainians to share their views with policymakers in New York. That enabled the US ambassador to tell the Security Council what to do. We've been connecting humanitarian partners to identify what else needs to happen. And as we speak, we're coordinating civil society engagement to get across the world to engage with their governments to ask that Russia is suspended from the UN Human Rights Council in a vote that will take place tomorrow.
Thank you, Nicola. Let me bring Alex into this conversation as well. Alex, your organization works with funders advancing peace and security efforts. I know you wanted to respond here as well. I want to just frame this crisis in Ukraine against a much larger global backdrop, with Yemen considered among the leading, if not the largest, humanitarian crisis in the world. Afghanistan, Syria. This crisis in Ukraine is happening against all of this. So how are you and your colleagues addressing the situation on the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Alice, and thanks, Nicola, for that sobering but important update. So we, like Nicola's organization, we work behind the scenes with funders, coordinating and helping support funders on peace and conflict issues and crisis issues, national security issues across the world. And when the war in Ukraine happened, we were thinking, well, what should we do? Should we do something? Because the week before that, there was, as you said, there's a bombing in Somalia. The week before that, there were more atrocities in Myanmar with the Rohingya. The week before that, so it's every week. It's every week there's something happening in our world. Ukraine got the attention because for many reasons, many reasons, and rightfully so. Folks are focused on Ukraine. One thing we haven't talked about is that Russia and the US together have 9,600 nuclear weapons on high alert. And so that is one difference that we have here. The other big difference, and many of my colleagues have written about this, is that Ukraine is Western, it is Christian, it is white. Many of the other conflicts that I've mentioned are not that. And so we talk a lot about white supremacy and systemic racism in the philanthropic sector, in just the world as we know it. And so sadly, the world, again, rightfully is paying attention to what is happening with the atrocities, as you said, Alice, in Bucha most recently, and in the war in Ukraine. And yet, this happens all the time in countries that perhaps aren't getting the attention they need. I mean, even back in August, when the war in Afghanistan was winding down, there was a huge surge, a rightful surge in humanitarian aid and focus. And folks are not talking about Afghanistan, and it quickly fell off. And so we have to question ourselves, why is it? What makes this conflict different than some of the other ones? Obviously, in addition to nuclear weapons, but I think what's very obvious to us is really questioning the premise on which a lot of this power, the power structures in the world are focused. And so we're trying to raise those issues up within the funder network and help funders better understand how do you address those root causes of conflict, like inequity around the globe. I think you're muted.
Thank you, Alex. And let me bring in Jocelyn. Jocelyn, your organization has been working with displaced people for 4 decades. I know you just returned from Poland and the border with Ukraine. Give us your thoughts as you're seeing it, as you saw it.
Great. Thanks, Alice. As you mentioned, Alight, which is a global humanitarian organization, has been really on the ground at the border of Poland and Ukraine since 3 days into the crisis. We're showing some photos here from my recent trip there over the weekend. And, what we're seeing is that this is the largest displacement since World War II. We've seen, 4 million people have fled Ukraine, and many more millions are displaced within the country as well. What we are really doing in sort of three three types of activities at the border within Ukraine and then within Poland and beyond into Europe. So the first is a set of activities that we call Do the Doable. And so, it's been incredibly cold the last 6 weeks. In Ukraine and Poland, we've been buying blankets for people and hats and gloves and providing them with coats. We've seen people have trouble crossing the border on foot, and so we've bought wheelchairs and donated them to the local paramedics. We're buying suitcases and giving them to people that are coming across with plastic bags that are falling apart. We're helping people carry their pets and juggle their bags as they make this journey across the border. We're also procuring tons and tons of food and emergency medical supplies and health and hygiene items, and we're shipping them every day into Ukraine to provide them with people in need. The second aspect of what we're doing is what we call guides and guiding people on their journey. So we have people that are standing at train stations and asking people what their needs are. We have an online platform called Kuja Kujo where we've gathered data from over 1,000 people, asking them what their immediate needs are today. We are providing short-term housing to people up to 30 days through a partnership that we have with Airbnb.org and helping people get really safe and dignified housing, both within Poland or wherever it is that they want to stay in Europe or beyond. And then the third aspect of what we're doing is setting up what we call these havens. And so we're working to set up sort of community centers, safe spaces for women and children and their elderly parents who are oftentimes accompanying them across the border. One of our partner organizations, ORAM, is setting up an LGBTQ safe haven in Berlin. And so we're really trying to provide the psychosocial support to people that they need in this time of crisis, as well as providing them with safe, warm spaces to really go and decompress and figure out what their next steps are. So, Alight has been really focused on sort of providing support to people in so many different ways at the border, at the reception centers, at the train stations, and then beyond as people look to their next move. And the sort of next chapter for us is to start to transition from this short-term, immediate support in the first, hours and days and weeks into really thinking about what that medium-term support is around housing, getting kids into schools, livelihood opportunities, medical care, et cetera. So that's sort of the work that we're doing, really direct support on the ground in Ukraine, Poland, and beyond.
Thank you. Jocelyn, I have a follow-up for you. As we noted, you aren't just working on Ukraine. Your own work, as you note, there are 82 million refugees and displaced people in the world. How do you prioritize each conflict and each crisis against the ongoing work that you have to do in these additional countries?
Yeah, so Alight works in about 20 countries today. We're fortunate that we have a model where our country directors are really enterprise leaders and they are running the country programs. They're making all the decisions about strategy, funding, teaming, et cetera, for the country programs that we operate in. And so what that means is that when we have a crisis like this, our leadership team, myself and others from our global team can really focus a lot of energy on the immediate crisis at hand, while our enterprise leaders, our country directors are able to really balance that by staying very focused on the programs that they're running in those countries. And so I think we are in a place now where we're seeing emerging crises, the massive fire in Somaliland and Hargeisa at the market happened last week. Somaliland and Somalia is a place that we have significant programming in. So something like that is going to require some of our attention right now as well to really bolster the country team in support of the communities there. We're seeing exceptional, drought and famine emerging in the Horn of Africa. And so again, that's a place that we need to pay more attention as well. So I think it is sort of a balance of like keeping the existing country programs going and running well and using our existing local leadership to drive that, while at the same time ensuring that we're able to raise additional funding, put additional attention to those crises as they emerge.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I'd like to go to Alex Toma next here. as we consider the staggering work, the rebuilding work, the humanitarian, the immediate to the long-term work that has to happen in Ukraine, what do you think this means for social impact work in that region and beyond?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on what Jocelyn was saying about raising funds. There, our sector, the conflicts that we've mentioned throughout the course of this conversation, as well as what's happening now in Ukraine, our sector only receives barely 1% of all donations in the world. Say that
You
again.
mean philanthropic donations?
Correct, philanthropic donations, yes. Although I will say here in the US, the State Department is funded at 1% of the federal budget. So it's about even, diplomacy development is at about 1%, where you see defense and national security at much higher levels. But I would say that, funders, we call ourselves peace and security funders. Not many folks sort of distinguish themselves as peace and security funders. But what I would say is that we need to take a broader look at who are peace and security funders. Everyone can play a role. There are lots of different ways. I put a link in the chat for everybody to see how folks are showing up and how people are funding in this specific conflict. But I would say that that kind of funding can happen across the globe. It does happen across the globe, and it's not enough. When there's only about 400 million a year philanthropically that goes towards peace and conflict issues, including preventing atrocities, preventing nuclear war, preventing war in general, peace building, that's not enough. And folks need to de-silo themselves and think, oh, I'm a girls' education funder, I'm a climate funder, I'm a water funder. Well, none of those things can happen when there's a crisis, as we're seeing now in Ukraine very starkly. So I would say folks should sort of, how does it impact the social impact work in the region? It's think more broadly, think a little bit more medium to long term, think of yourself as a part of this community that is trying to help now, but also think in the future a bit more, and give to organizations like Jocelyn's and Nicola's.
And Alex, when I asked you to define these philanthropic donations, but you've also said that actually everyone has to be a peace and security funder, because that's the container in which all of this work can do. But as I'm thinking about individual philanthropists, maybe with a family foundation, or an individual who's listening, who's an activist and doesn't have a foundation, how do people, even smaller funders who don't think that they have a portfolio of peace and security, how do they get in the game?
Yeah, easy. Fund the work of public foundations that are already on the ground. Urgent Action Fund is a PSFG member, has been working in the region and across the globe for decades. Fund the people who are local. Fund the people who are doing the work, who have the connections. Don't start a new program. Dip your toes in. There are folks doing great work on the ground right now. Foundations who are doing great work. So you can fund third-party intermediaries to do the work if you yourself don't want to. There are a lot of donor pools. OSF, George Soros just started a $25 million donor pool. Join that. You don't have to do the sort of legwork, the hard legwork of thinking about, what is the strategy? How do you measure it? Who are the partners? There are people already doing that. And I'm happy to connect with others as well if they want more info.
And as I hear you saying it, you may have a topic like climate, like water, food insecurity, but if you're funding peace and security, you're actually advancing the other issue areas as well.
Yeah, I would argue you can't get bed nets to folks. You can't get food to people when they're fleeing conflict, when they're scared to go out of their homes. So I would say everybody is a peace and security funder if you want your issue, whatever that may be, to actually be, successful.
Thank you for that. I think a number of people would not think of themselves in that way, but with your framing, it's awfully helpful. Thank you, Alex. And let me bring Nicola back into the conversation. Nicola, you have at this forum, and I know within this community, incredible social impact leaders representing more than 90 countries in the world. Speak personally to us. What can individuals do as they think about the crisis in Ukraine right now? And even as we're talking this afternoon, Palo Alto time, it is incomprehensible, these images that we're seeing. And I hope we don't get to a place where we're desensitized. But what's your personal call to action to us as individuals and potentially at institutions that can do something about this crisis?
Thanks, Alice. I mean, again, what's so agonizing, and Jocelyn and Alex have both spoken about this, is this is not a new playbook.
Yeah.
We have seen this, these appalling. I started my work in the wake of the Rwandan genocide. Bodies in the streets. We have seen the bombs falling on civilians, on buildings that are marked as being civilian, and still the bombs fall. I think what's really powerful, I mean, our attention, first and foremost, that solidarity, that message, I think personally that is incredibly important. And then the privilege that I've had to work with breathtakingly brave human rights defenders, individuals, civilians, that sense of knowing you are seen, you are heard, you are not forgotten is so powerful. But of course, I think it's also about where we put our political attention, and how we show those of us that are blessed to be in democracies, even when they are frail, that our policymakers are listening to where we put our attention, the demand that we have, the more compassionate politics, about how there will be efforts for accountability, that there is the provision of humanitarian assistance. A system right now is robbing Peter to pay Paul, the agonies of resources being diverted to meet the escalating needs in Ukraine, while we're watching food insecurity rise elsewhere.
Wait a minute, I want to get you to repeat that, Nicola. You're saying that resources are being diverted, and are you saying that is a mistake?
That is absolutely the fact that we had a humanitarian response system that was already groaning at the seams, even before the horrors that began on the 24th of February. Mm-hmm. We're watching right now the appeals, the humanitarian appeals. We watch as there is now the sense of governments and others closing pots of money and reorienting towards Ukraine. But that sense of where we put our political attention, where we put our funding, how we put our funding, and how we support those that enable collaboration, voices to be heard, and those who are directly affected by conflict to speak truth to power. Those are all pieces where we start to uphold those basic rules of saying how we uphold the rules that we built in the UN, the UN refugee conventions, how we ensure that we host people, that we stay welcoming people who have to flee their homes. I think those are all those pieces through our attention, through the resources of our civic engagement, as well as our financial resources of how we actually meet the needs of both Ukraine and those that are beyond the headlines.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up before I bring in Alex again. Nicola, you hear I'm based in the US and certainly watching the international response. How do you make an appeal to funders, to the global community, that this is not just Europe's problem?
So you think about those words of the UN. It was built in the wake of the Second World War to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And in every conflict that I have worked on, from Sudan through to Syria, that appeal of those that are caught with the bombs flying, protect us, whether it is no-fly zones, peacekeeping operations, that demand that we would all want, that if we had to make a decision to protect our own child, to know, we would want to know that we could actually look to an international community. That idea that even wars have rules, that I think the stake here, what is not new is the scale of the violations. What is powerful is we are watching a level of unity and action that is proof that when political will is there, we can try and sanction those who will profit from war. We can try and draw attention to investigate the crimes and ensure there will be accountability. And so that, I think, is true whether you are in Syria, whether in Afghanistan, whether in Yemen, that we actually need to uphold those basic rules of how governments have responsibilities to their populations, that you don't get to do whatever you want with sovereignty, that we need a United Nations that is effective and a humanitarian system that can respond. And those commitments about how arms are sold, about how refugee rights are upheld, that is as true for people who are fleeing from the Sahel in West Africa as it is for those in South Sudan or even in Ukraine. I think in that human reality, I think we connect to something is afflicting human beings from Somalia through to Azerbaijan.
Thank you. I want to bring in Alex right now, who penned an op-ed in the Chronicle of Philanthropy outlining a pathway for funders to get into this if they aren't right now. If you could be as practical and as brief in this time.
What did the op-ed say? Is that what you're asking?
What are the pathways? What are your suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I penned the op-ed 2-3 days after the invasion of Ukraine, so a lot has changed. But I felt like my grandmother is Ukrainian, and I felt like there was something, I have a personal connection to the country, and there's something that our people can do, the people, who we organize, and so I felt like, let's speak. Let me use whatever power I have to try and sort of move folks. And I think rightfully, humanitarian aid. We've talked a lot about that. Getting facts from the ground for which policymakers and NGO colleagues can sort of make their decisions, like actual data. So we need to fund journalists. We need to fund those that are there reporting about and taking pictures of what we're now seeing as atrocities. And then the third sort of boring but important thing is fund more. There's not enough money, and as Nicola said, the money gets shifted around depending on what crisis, what conflict is happening. There's not enough money. Like I said, it's less than 1% of all total philanthropic donations. That's just not enough. And I will say one thing for all the funders out there, philanthropists. In the U.S., all you have to do is just fund up to 5% of your endowment.
Yeah, that's
fund
right.
a little bit more. Give a little bit more than 5%, 10% maybe.
Alex,
double the funding.
You're giving numbers. So do you have a number in your mind? What do you need? What would be, how many billions are we talking to make a dent?
I mean, human rights is at 1.4 billion a year. Peace and security is at about 400 million. So even if we doubled it, that would be great. That would be more money. It's such a small group of dedicated, passionate, incredible folks who are constantly, focusing on crisis and crisis and crisis. So there's that. And then there's the longer term. It's really hard to fund peace and conflict because how do you prove a negative? How do you prove when you've stopped a war or a genocide? And so there's that long-term patient capital that needs to flood into our field. So those would be my recommendations for everybody getting involved.
Great, thank you. And I know that we have some audience and participant questions here, so let me start to pose them. And thanks for our attendees for hanging in there with us and contributing to this really important conversation. So question number one, Jocelyn, good to have you back. Why are the United Nations and the UNSC and the leader of all the UN bodies failing to ensure that the UN Charter is respected? As Zelensky said to the UN Security Council yesterday, this is the very reason the UN was created. Why the failure? Any one of you who would like to respond?
Should I jump in on that? So, I mean, the fact is, it comes back to that point of what we demand of our own governments. It's politics stupid. The way that in the wake of the Second World War, governments came together to organize the UN. So it's a group of governments. It's what everybody agrees to do, the rules of how this was set. And the reality is it was structured around those that won the Second World War, those permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And it's one of the reasons why it makes this conflict so fraught to have a permanent member of the Security Council seeking to change the borders of another member of the United Nations is an extraordinary political challenge. And it's why there's no question the multilateral system is absolutely under strain at this moment. And yet, as we speak, we have got civil society groups engaging with governments across the world to say that around the Human Rights Council, this piece of the UN architecture that was set is to say there are some rules here about if you want to be on that Human Rights Council, it was baked into the formulation of the council. If you commit gross abuses, you don't get the privilege of sitting on the council. This will only be the second time that a member state has been voted off. Libya was the first in the wake of threatening ethnic cleansing and the slaughter of the people of Benghazi in 2013. And so it is a moment, I think, actually, of trying to regather some credibility for a system that's absolutely been failing people from Syria through to Yemen. I mean, so much that has been, but again, it's also where we demand of our governments of what we expect, where the US Congress passed rules around arms being sold to Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis, who are currently prosecuting a war in Yemen. That is one of those moments of having more consistency around how to uphold at the national level what governments do. And in that, again, in the civic space and our own engagement is part of how we make global governance actually work and matter. It can feel really distant, but we're actually part of it through the decisions that we make in our engagement with our elected officials, with our governments. That is a link to actually getting a world with rules rather than the lawlessness that is the appalling prospect.
Thank you, Nicola. So this question is either Jocelyn or Alex. What can the private sector do to support refugees? And I want to say refugees and displaced people, because we're already working within this larger context of people who have already fled and are displaced. What can the private sector do in the long term, in addition to funding? The quote goes on, I heard partnering with those doing the work on the ground and local organizations is the first start. Any other suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think this crisis is an interesting one because there are so many international companies or multinational companies that are operating in or have an interest in Poland and Ukraine. So I mentioned our partnership with Airbnb.org. You know, there's plenty of Airbnb stock available across Europe. And so that provides a great opportunity for temporary housing. And with the generosity of the company, they're able to do that, right? Uber has made similar commitments in terms of providing free rides for people to be able to get from the border, from the train station into the accommodations. And so we're also partnering with Uber to get similar credits to help people get into those temporary homes. Where there's a company called Pocket Talk that has these small translation devices. They sent us a shipment of them and are offering more, but you speak into them in one language and it outputs in a different language. And so when you have volunteers on the ground that don't speak Polish or Ukrainian, they're able to use these Pocket Talk devices in order to better communicate with people. We're working with a company called Embrace, which provides affordable baby incubators, and they're donating those in order to get into hospitals in Ukraine for premature babies that might need those as well. So I think there's so much opportunity. You know, there's so much need within Ukraine for food, for medical supplies, for hygiene and health items. And so I think any types of those donations, organizations like Alight and others are really eager to accept, and we have the supply chains and the ability. We have the warehousing space in places like Poland. Okay. We have the convoys available to be able to transport them into Ukraine and really get them to the people most in need.
Alice, can I just jump in on that real quick? Yeah. For everybody? I would say, I think those are wonderful examples, Jocelyn. I think at the baseline, like, question your assumptions about what you need in a job. Like we're doing a hiring process. Do we need to look for a bachelor's degree? Does the person need to be based in DC? No, like we don't need any of that. So if you're talking about, you know, supporting all refugees, offer jobs. People need jobs. People need, you know, and just kind of start from ground zero and just kind of question your assumptions about why aren't you hiring certain people? You know.
Well, Alex, let's dig in on that. So you're really making a call for the private sector to do more than just give.
Yeah.
You're saying, and I'm also assuming that you're thinking as broadly across the private sector. It's sort of almost the kitchen sink. Do what you can in every way.
Exactly. Be creative. I mean, incubators for babies, you know, like plastic bags to cart people. I mean, this is like Jocelyn's examples, but like just things are not the same as they were because we're in COVID times. We're on a screen instead of, you know, in Oxford together like we were years ago. This is the time to sort of not throw the baby out with the bathwater, as Americans say, but just like rethink your assumptions, rethink the way things are, the way things could be. Why are things the way they are? I don't know, because it's how we've always done them. Well, why? Who made the rules? A bunch of people who, you know, won the war. Who was that? It was mostly like white Western, like Judeo-Christian men. Why? I don't know. Let's really start breaking it down. Like, this is the time to be really generative and creative and innovative. So I would say that too. I mean, the private sector give people jobs in addition to what you're providing them, sort of money and baby formula and whatever else.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up to ask all three of you to respond to this as briefly as you can in under a minute, so we can keep going with the questions. But given what we've all lived through during this pandemic, but obviously our geographic location, our socioeconomic status has widely affected how this crisis has landed for us as individuals. So that range is vast. But do you all feel any sense that our collective vulnerability has emerged and perhaps created a situation where we might be more responsive to what's happening globally in these crises?
Certainly. I mean, I think when people see gas prices rise so dramatically, right, they're like, oh, wow, I'm actually feeling this, right? This crisis didn't take long to hit me. I think our world is so globalized right now, so interconnected. We're recognizing, the food prices. We're seeing, food prices go up in sub-Saharan Africa, where already food prices have been rising due to climate change and drought and causing famine and all the rest. And so I think that is really exacerbated. I think Ukraine does feel close because it's, connected to Europe, because I think it brings back a lot of memories around World War II. I think people look like many of us look. And so I do think that there is this feeling of real interconnection. And this is hitting close to home for people, which is making them more, I would say, active and supportive in this crisis than we see in other crises that feel much further away.
Right.
I mean,
yeah,
just
COVID. Sorry, go ahead, Nicola.
Alex, go. No, Alex.
No, I was just gonna say, if COVID didn't sort of put us all in these little boxes, literally on our Zoom screens, and can affect everybody equally, I think that has shown us, has sort of humbled everybody across the board. And now on top of that, as you're seeing, a direct crisis in Western Europe, in our partners in Western Europe, and to food, to gas, to everything. Now is the time. We're in a different paradigm, I think, and I think people do have this sort of leveling on so many different levels. It's a tiny silver lining of all of this, tiny.
Okay, Nicola.
Yeah, I think it's. I think that the challenge around this is actually, as for all of us as who have the privilege of working to in this sector and this issue, is actually to make the connection. I think we do feel this is of unprecedented global proportions, as you say, of food security, of energy prices, the implications of what will happen. But we need to do more to make sure we capture that, to really turn it into the potential of the compassion transforming politics. So it's not, let's look at the certainly, speaking for myself and as people that look like me, it's actually that the most precious thing about this is whatever we look like, we have a common humanity, and that how do we transform that into the same preoccupations that we have now about Ukraine for those in the Sahel, where we can make a difference, in the Yemen, where we can make a difference, that the action we ask of our governments, the assistance that is given, the aid that is given, the politics that are given, the hosting to refugees. And I think very quickly, Alice, I think one of the things that we saw in the pandemic is we realized this connection between those of us that are concerned with health, with those of us that are concerned with inequality, with those of us that are concerned with gender rights, with those of us that are concerned with the environment, those of us that are concerned on conflict. We saw those connections suddenly come to light, because actually, and we saw new vulnerabilities then as well about not being able to get our kids to school, whether you're in a refugee camp in Burkina Faso or whether you are living, surprise, surprise, with my voice, where I was in London. And I think we have to sustain that focus so that it doesn't dissipate. We haven't got vaccine access, and we've known it. A moment of connection, if we're not careful, dissipates. How do we tap into this moment of connection, actually, to take it into everyone that is facing those horrific abuses that we've seen in Butcher? It is not the only place in the world where those appalling things happen, and we can make a difference, I believe, in where we put our attention and our gaze.
Thank you. This question is for Alex. This conversation begs the question of why foundations need to preserve their endowments for perpetuity in the face of clear and present dangers. What's your response, Alex?
I don't know. We push for going above and beyond the 5%, minimum floor and looking more to do more. And some have during COVID, especially some have. But there's always I can argue the other side, which is essentially, well, you never know, like what's going to happen down the world, down the line. Something even worse can happen. And I don't know. 3 years ago, we had Trump, we had COVID, we had racial reckoning,
Yeah.
we had, the climate is burning. You all had wildfires out there. You can walk around. I mean, how much worse can it get? Yeah, it could get worse, but Jesus, like now is the time. Now is it? You have money. You have the privilege of having money. Spend it now.
Well, that actually pivots to our next question. I'll present that to Jocelyn. Question: how can we sustain donor interest in Ukraine? We had no trouble raising funds over the last few weeks, but I'm worried about lagging attention even as needs mount. Jocelyn?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's inevitable, right? And I think I think for humanitarian organizations, I think you start to understand what these flows of funding are. And I think the early wave is private funding. And that's the generosity of everyday people that are watching the news and say, what can I do to help? And they look to organizations that they're familiar with or that they hear about on the news, and they make those $50, $1,000, or $10 donations. And that is the way that you, as a nonprofit, really are able to fund the early support. Organizations like UNHCR, IOM, USAID, and others, they will come in and they will support this crisis, but it's probably going to be 6 months from the moment of the crisis before organizations like ours are going to see those contributions. And so I think it's really understanding, like, how do you bridge that private funding into public funding and recognize that that's what we're going to be on in terms of a trajectory, as opposed to thinking that we're somehow this time going to sustain that private funding. It's not. That's not going to happen. So, yeah.
Jocelyn, your organization has been at this for 4 decades, and I think the world is watching, and none of us can say what will happen in the next day or week. As you forecast, do you either have a sense of how many millions it's going to take to serve displaced people and refugees? Do you have a sense of the numbers? What is some forecasting that you've done that you can share with us?
Yeah.
Yes, I realize I'm putting you on the spot, but I think our audience, I would like to hear from leaders like yourselves for whom this is not your first time in a crisis like this.
Yeah, I don't know if Nicola or Alex have more on the financial numbers. I mean, I think, I think it's really open right now in terms of what's going to happen. There are 4 million displaced people outside of Ukraine right now. At the same time, when I was there over the weekend, they were seeing about 20,000 people per day crossing from Ukraine into Poland. And they're seeing about 18,000 crossing back from Poland into Ukraine. And so, that said, I think what's happening at the border is very fluid right now. People are going back and forth. They're going back to see their husbands, to pick up a pet. They're going to check on their homes. They're going back because they can't work as single mothers in Europe, not speaking the language. And there aren't those job opportunities for them to be able to work from home while they're caretaking at the same time that they're working. And so, I think it's a bit up in the air when people are going to feel safe to go back, what's going to happen with this conflict, what Russia sort of decides to do next. But I mean, I think the cost of this is going to be billions, right? I think so many cities in Ukraine are going to need to be fully reconstructed. And I think that's a really expensive endeavor, not to mention the cost that it's going to take to provide cash transfers and medical care and housing support to the 4 million who are currently in Europe or beyond, plus all of the displaced people within Ukraine. So this is a crisis at an enormous magnitude.
Alex, did you want to respond?
I don't know. I mean, that's the honest answer. I mean, as you said, Alice, things change day to day. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, again, I kind of mentioned it at the top about nuclear weapons. I mean, God forbid there's a radiological weapon, dirty bomb, nuclear weapon used. I mean, that brings it to a whole nother level of cost and horror. And, we're not even talking about that. And there are 9,600 nuclear weapons on high alert between the US and Russia. So I can't say.
Nicola,
I mean,
any
yeah, I was going to say, so it's such a powerful question. And actually, it's something where there aren't good, I think, global numbers on this, but it's a really powerful one. We did some estimates a couple of years ago on looking at South Sudan, like trying to estimate the cost of war, of failing to resolve the war over 5, 10, and 15 years as a price tag on peace. And I think that, again, it is possible to do those calculations. It is hard and it's proxy indicators, but I think it's both not just the cost, as Alex has said, what does it mean to protect people, but the prize of preventing death, I think, and loss is really huge. So I think the onus is on us as those of us that are change makers to actually draw up more of those scenarios to present that evidence. But I mean, just as one snapshot, that currently just the UN humanitarian appeals alone are 5.6% funded for this year, right? So that the
5.6% only funded.
Right? So yes, it's early in the year, but still, so the global requirement, 43.2 billion, and what's currently there is 2.43. I mean, and even that's humanitarian response. And that we know from each conflict, that will be where it's stripped down to a shoestring. This is not about ensuring sort of all the preventive work and the engagement, the trauma that the support to communities where for what they've just seen will be etched into families. But we can do a better job. And I think this opportunity, as Alex has said, about also being able to fund and support incredible local organizations, civil societies, human rights defenders, people who stand up, who try and uphold demands of their own government in the pursuit of democracy, whether in Russia or in Ukraine or in Sudan or in Yemen, and actually giving support to them and civic institutions, those processes that, that is also part of, again, what I think we're seeing here, some lessons of as well when governments don't take action, when you don't respond in 2014 to the Crimea, when you undermine mechanisms of accountability, the message is sent actually that these abuses or atrocities can continue. And again, I think that is where we can put pressure to actually halt and prevent something of the cost of conflict.
Thank you. As we get ready to close here in the next 5 minutes, I want to take the time to ask you about your reason for hope. You all are involved in challenging work, as many of our attendees are, from climate to food to peace to healthy democracy. You're doing critical work, and in this case with humanitarian crises, in particular your organizations, there's no way to sanitize what you're doing every day. Just the images of what we see globally and what you and your colleagues see. So what gives you hope to stay in this fight? Nicola, you referenced people on the ground, that there are people to fund. So even from a funder's perspective, Alex, I'm thinking we are so grateful for the people on the ground who are doing the work, that they even exist, that we can send resources to. So let's begin, Jocelyn, with you, and then Alex next. What gives you hope for your work, even in this context of this horrific crisis in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I would say being at the border and seeing the volunteers who have showed up every single day since, the very first day of the crisis. World Central Kitchen is an amazing organization. They have been on the front lines serving hot meals 24 hours a day at every, train station, reception center, border crossing. And that's staffed by volunteers who are cooking those meals and serving those meals. I think, we saw Scottish organizations and so many Jewish organizations and so many volunteer fire brigades and Boy Scout groups who are there, who are just showing up. They're sleeping in tents, they're taking showers in hostels, and they are just there doing the hard work every day, not getting paid, but because they see a need and they want to be there to respond. And so I think, to me, that just gives me so much hope in humans that they that they are so deeply committed to this crisis and supporting and doing what they can to make it better and more sort of humane and welcoming for the people that are coming across.
Thank you, Alex.
I agree. I was going to say humans. I mean, people are good. I believe people are fundamentally good. And it's just stories like this that you see, in Ukraine and across the world, of just people wanting to help one another out. In terms of my specific space, the philanthropic space, I've been in this space for about 15 years, and I have seen the way in which funders have changed their thinking about peace and conflict, and how, years ago we were talking about, locally led peace building. Oh, that's a concept. And now actually people are listening to those on the ground and not presuming to know what the answers are, and actually saying, oh, look, let's actually talk to local Ukrainians. What do you need? Do you need, whatever it is? I'm not even going to make it up. So that has changed. The trend is positive. It's arcing towards justice and equity. And I have seen it with my own short, career in this field, and that gives me hope.
Thank you, Nicola.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think we are seeing that upsurge of outrage. There are rules of how we expect to live on this planet together. I think we're seeing new levels of collaboration from governments. I think we're seeing businesses think harder about what they do to sustain or policies, practices. We've had great panels today about sort of the corruption that corrodes our politics of thinking. We've talked a lot about money doing good, but about where money does bad, like finally looking at closing some of the Russian oligarchs, here in London, and the loopholes that sustain conflict. We've campaigned to stop warlords of South Sudan being able to stash their money in the Kenyan bank system. Like, we're seeing some of those changes. And of course, we're seeing the power of collaboration and solidarity. And, that is, I've said this, I've shared, today I started out in the wake of the Rwandan genocide, and I have seen things and heard things and witnessed things that I know are a source. Sometimes the grief feels overwhelming, but it is in the midst of where human beings, where we do our worst to each other. I have had the privilege to find human beings at our absolute best, and just described it. And that is so fundamentally motivating. What is happening to the people of Ukraine as we speak? We must and can stand and demand and fund in ways that actually can protect succeeding generations from the scourge of war. We have done it, and we can do it again.
I can't think of a better way to close out our time together on an incredibly sobering and difficult conversation, but one that has to happen. I would just want to extend my thanks to all three of you: Nicola Reindorp with Crisis Action, Jocelyn with Alight, of course, Toma with the Peace and Security Funders Group. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Skoll World Forum team and Jessica Flutie for putting this together, this conversation, and to all of you who participated, who commented, and the resources that have been shared here. We are in, again, a really challenging time, and yet listening to your reasons for hope, I think it also boosts my sense of hope. And I would say, to break the moderator rules, I will answer my own question. Knowing that each of you is doing this work, the colleagues whom you represent, your organization, that is also a reason for hope. And I want to thank each of you and our participants today. Thank you. Be well.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alice. Thanks.